Camille Aubray is the author of the novel Cooking for Picasso, which was also terrific and will be in the link. It was chosen for People Magazine's picks of the best new books and the Indie Next Reading Group list. Aubray was an Edward Albee Foundation Fellowship winner and a writer in residence in the south of France. I like this. She was also a staff writer for One Life to Live in Capital. Aubray studied writing with her mentor, maybe someone you've heard of, Margaret Atwood, at Humber College in Toronto, and was a finalist for the Pushcart Press Editors Book Award and the Eugene O'Neill National Playwrights Conference. Fiona Davis is the New York Times bestselling author of 5 novels, including The Dollhouse, The Address, The Lions of Fifth Avenue, and The Magnolia Place. I also happen to know she is a woman who's had many careers, including acting, and she was also a journalist. I have read all her books, and I'm a huge fan, so let's give a shout out to Fiona. There'll be easy links in the chat box as well. So at this point, we're just delighted to get the conversation going, and we're grateful to have Camille Aubray and Fiona Davis here. So ladies, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I am thrilled to be here tonight with Camille to talk about the Godmothers. When I was sent this book, I was so excited because it was exactly the type of book I truly adore. And you know, it's historical fiction. It's from a very female point of view. And I was just so impressed with so many things that I'm very excited to ask lots of questions, because you wrote a book that's very, it's kind of epic, and it's a challenge. You have multiple points of view. There's a lot going on. And it's gotten wonderful reviews. Publishers Weekly called it an addictive, intense, multi-generational feminist romp through World War II era New York City, and that it credibly flips the script on male domination. They have, oh dear. Am I back?
Yeah.
You have to bear with me. For some reason, there's a little issue here, so I'm going to get right to the question. It's all about the family, and yet you spotlight the women involved, whether by blood or as in-laws. And what inspired you to take this approach?
Well, you know, there were, as you know, as an author, there's never just one thing that inspires you. There are a number of things. So part of it was that I had worked in New York City. And you know that those buildings that you write about are just full of history and full of ghosts. And because I was working in television, one of the places that we went to was the Copacabana, where the National Academy of TV Arts and Sciences used to have a lot of their events, luncheons and dinners and awards. And the elder people, you know, the people who had been there a while, they were older actors, producers, directors, they told stories about New York City. And they just, you know, they said the Copa used to be, you know, you could run into a movie star, you could run into a ball player, you could run into a gangster. So, you know, you go through all of those different places, the majestic apartment building. I started asking questions and thinking about it. And the gangsters kept popping up, you know, and I like the 1930s, 40s, and 50s anyway. I was gravitating toward that as the focus. Well, somewhere along the way in the research that I did, I came across a quote from Mario Puzo, and he said that every time the Godfather opened his mouth, he heard his mother speak. He said he heard her wisdom, her love of family, her ruthlessness when necessary, her high intelligence. And he said these were qualities not valued in women at the time. I was like, wow, well, you know, I love the Godfather movies. I think they're wonderful. But, you know, the women are very shadowy figures. They're in the background. And, you know, you always wonder, well, you know, who were they? And for Mario Puzo to say this, I went back and listened to The Godfather, which was on television recently. And, you know, if you listen to all of the wise things he says, I said, well, that could be a woman, you know, that could be. That's very interesting with this whole machismo thing. So, all right. So I decided I wanted to explore that a little. And I think about these women as like underappreciated, even by the people who, you know, love them and know them. They still don't really necessarily appreciate their smarts. And I like the idea of sisters-in-law because they're from different backgrounds, but they're married into the family. And everybody knows, every woman knows, you know, when a new daughter-in-law comes into the family. She might not be accepted right away. Maybe there's a little rite of passage. So I said, okay, so now I've got, a woman who's an Irish nurse. I've got a French girl. I've got the daughter of the family. And then I've got someone who came over from Italy. So I loved seeing them collide, and eventually bond. So.
And so, yeah, you're talking of these four women. Can you tell us a little bit about them and their backgrounds? I love the way you draw us in. And then what intrigued you about the idea of godmothers in the story?
Yes. Well, I'm thinking about godmothers as, okay, so you have the mother and she has all of these duties about raising the child. You have the grandmother who might be a little subversive and might even undermine her daughter a little bit, but a godmother has responsibilities. She is supposed to mentor the child so that in case something happens to the mother, she will raise that child. So she's sort of made that promise. And therefore, a godmother I see her as someone who's there, as wise counsel. If you're having, love life problems or career problems or something, she might be someone you could talk to who's different than talking to a mother or a sister or, even a grandmother. And at the same time, I thought about fairy tales, fairy godmothers and how, iconic they are. So I said, well, what if these women are trying to be that kind of a godmother, be a little magical, but be practical too when necessary. So I don't know. I think that's where it all came from.
And can you tell us a little about each woman?
Yes. Okay. So we have Petrina, who is the daughter in the family, and she has three brothers, and her brothers are the ones that marry these other gals. And Petrina, they all have their secrets. They all have something that from their past that they're a little ashamed of and that they don't really want to talk about. They want to leave behind. They want to build a new life. But in the way that secrets in the past do, they come back to haunt them. And they have to deal with these secrets. They raise their heads at various inconvenient times. And that creates part of the plot twists. You don't really know what they're going to do. How are they going to respond when this secret is out in the open? And how are the other women going to respond? Will they support her or will they accept her? So.
Okay. And you start in the 1930s and you travel to current time. What were the challenges to writing this sweeping story?
Well, I think it was just important to follow the generations. That was the guide. So you have the matriarch of the family is Tessa, and then the patriarch is Johnny, and they've raised these children, the three boys and Petrina, and then their job was survival in the way that, all immigrants who come, are just trying to survive and trying to survive under the thumb of the five families, the gangsters that were rather predatory when they wanted to be. So the family that I'm dealing with is just trying to, have their business, have their family, and have to sort of placate these five families, without getting too sucked in, without becoming, too much a part of them. So then you have the next generation, which are the four godmothers. So there's Lucy, the nurse, Amy, the French gal, and Philomena, who came over from Italy with her dark secrets. And so now that generation is trying to get beyond the older generation. They're trying to pass the baton. They want to ease out of any businesses that, are connected to the gangsters. And then you finally have their daughters and their sons, and they want to engage more with the rest of the world. They don't see the rest of the world quite as frightening as their parents might, but they also don't know how to negotiate those landmines. And when they hit one or two of them, they need their parents' help to tell them, how to deal with the world. So by doing the generations of the family, it moved us through time pretty easily.
I imagine you had a pretty extensive family tree that you worked from.
Yes, spoken as a true writer who does research. Yes, yes. And I always calculate how old they'd be at a certain year, right? How old their children would be. Well, then what does that mean? When did she have that child? And I do all of that calculation and you keep that chart handy. Yes, absolutely. It was on a corkboard for a while. And then I had the chart of the five families, the different heads of the mob. And boy, that was another family tree. So
no. What other kind of research did you do for this book?
Well, apart from, the reading of nonfiction, biographies and things like that, what I like to do is look at the old newspapers of the time. They are not always accurate. But, when it comes to, mob rub out or something like that, they're very dramatic. And you get the lingo of the day too. And you get quotes from, what the gangsters said and did, what the doorman said and that sort of thing. So I love that, and then, I also talk to people, New Yorkers, and they all have a story. There's always something. It doesn't pop out right away. But when when you talk about what you're working on, and then they say, oh, well, did you know? And then they tell you something that they heard, so.
Yes, that's perfect. And you were talking earlier about secrets. And that's one of the things I love to include in a book is how secrets affect later generations. And in your book, it feels like the secrets possibly weigh heavily more on the women than the men. Can you talk a little towards
Sure.
that?
Well, I think as a society, even now, aren't we much more forgiving of men than we are of women? I mean, men can, they can make all kinds of excuses for them. And we sort of say, well, boys will be boys, take politicians, for example. So, but, I think that women are shamed more. So therefore they anticipate being rejected. They anticipate, oh, if they hear this, they won't understand. They won't know what the circumstances were. They won't care to know what the circumstances were of why I did this or why this happened. So I think that secrets are a bigger burden for women. But so are the things that, that they would be shamed for. So I think we could still improve, in the way that we judge, if a man has a tantrum, well, in the office or something versus a woman, we just are not as kind to women. So, I'm just single-handedly trying to work on that.
And I love the character of Philomena. She's kind of this unexpected leader. She's really good with numbers and finance. And in fact, throughout the story, you really deal with issues of money and lending because the success of the business, the family business, is paramount.
Right.
And what inspired you to kind of confront these issues in the novel?
Well, it's funny because 19th century novels used to write a great deal about debt. Now, often they did it from the point of view of someone who was wealthy and had a gambling problem, but debt is debt. And, if you owe money to someone like a loan shark or you owe money and you can't pay it, it is a spiral. So novels dealt with that quite a bit. I mean, think of The House of Mirth, right? Edith Wharton and Lily Bart. I mean, that literally killed her because, she was trying to find a way to hold on to her principles and still deal with debt. So, and then Dostoevsky, of course, Balzac, people are, they didn't mind talking about money and debt. We're a little, funny about that sometimes in modern times. So I said, well, let me just take a look at this. And then somewhere, I think I was thinking about Elena Ferranti, my brilliant friend. She had the character who was brilliant. And then there was a character, a very scary woman who was a loan shark, and she was murdered. And she had, what these guys always had, a book of who owed what. And I always thought that the brilliant character should have gotten control of that book. And then I think she would have gone in a really interesting direction. I just thought it was interesting. So that's why I wanted to incorporate that with Philomena. What happens when you suddenly, have power? But, even when you have power over someone's debt, you control the debt, you control a certain amount of things, but you also have a responsibility if you're a caring person like she is, and you're not just, your average loan shark. So to me, that was a very interesting thing. And she didn't want her children to ever go into debt. She didn't. So that was her goal, her ability with numbers. I kind of got from my Aunt Rose. I had an Aunt Rose who used to be able to add up like these long columns of 3-figure numbers in her head. And she just could tell you what the total was like that. And she had an affinity for numbers. So I said, well, okay. So that sort of figured in with the money and the character of dealing with, finances. So that just sort of evolved.
I love Aunt Rose. That's fantastic. And the men in the family, the 3 brothers, they're very strong characters. They love their wives. They're very family oriented, but for certain reasons, including World War II, they have to step away from the family at times and leave the women to fend for themselves. And so how did you write it so that the godmothers really deal with these situations in a way that might be different from what a man would?
Yes. Well, they're good guys. They love their wives. They love their family. They love their parents. They respect them. But they, you depend on your husband. You depend on the guy that you love, and he feels like a rock of Gibraltar. But there are times when he might get sick, or he might have, something might happen, and you have to pick up the reins. And, what if you're not prepared for that? And these women were surprised by it. They rise to the occasion. They have to. But it's something to consider, that you can't always expect to be able to leave everything in the hands of the guy, and that includes, balancing a checkbook. That includes, your financing, your retirement and everything. These are things that women, are sometimes discouraged from getting involved with. But you have to, because you may have to pick up the reins. And now how women deal with things differently. I think that women, well, at least my characters are not bent on revenge. Even when they offend each other, they don't really try to wreak revenge on each other, which maybe the gangsters would have, they don't really take well to slights. So I think that women tend to want to discuss things, to sort of work things out. And my godmothers literally sit around the table and they say, okay, what are we going to do about this? How can we deal with this? Even if, you've gotten me mad at you or something, now, when it comes to dealing with the gangsters, they pretty much have to be clever. They have to sort of figure out, what can I say or do that will make him do what I want? So, without being flirtatious or any of that stuff. So they just have to be appeal to the businessman in the gangster, which actually, is kind of an interesting quality about the gangsters. They were underneath it all businessmen. So, you could kind of make sense to them if you knew how to talk to them. And that's what these gals have to figure out how to do.
And they certainly do. And in fact, your novel has these real life gangsters in it, including Lucky Luciano, Tommy Three Finger Lucchese, Tony Bender Strollo. What made you choose each of these gangsters?
Well, honestly, they are all so fascinating. Yeah. But let's take Lucky Luciano. To me, was representative of the commission. And that's how the gangsters worked out their, disagreements a lot of the time, and decided who they could kill and who they weren't going to kill, and who they want to let live. So Lucky Luciano organized them. He was the businessman. He said, look, we have to be like a business. And, to some kind of credit, that's what he did. Now, Albert Anastasia was the head of Murder Incorporated. I mean, that's a hit squad. So that's who he represents in the novel, that's scary stuff. Strollo was the ultimate capo, the data, he runs the day-to-day stuff. He's the guy that you talk to first, let's see. Oh, Tommy Lucchese. Well, his business, he even admitted his business was that he started out, he would wash your windows for you. And if you didn't want him to wash your windows might get broken. So, now Frank Costello, he was really, really trying to be more of a real businessman. And he was, I saw him as probably the easier one to negotiate with, because he was more realistic and more, he was, he knew politicians. He was friends with politicians. He was friends with, the legitimate guys. And he really wanted to be more legitimate, So I thought that they all represented these different facets of this particular, era and characters.
And the Greenwich Village plays a really big part in the book. Did you do a lot of walking tours around there?
Yeah. I had, for a little while, I used to dance. It was only like, I call it semi-professionally because we had an audience and stuff, but I wasn't, with the ballet or anything. But we used to do performances in the village. So I rehearsed a lot there, and I performed there. And I taught at NYU for a while, so I knew that area as well. So I really got to learn about it. And for instance, Balducci's Market started out, little more than a pushcart enterprise at the beginning. So that was all part of the Greenwich Village history. And there were various gangsters who eventually lived there, and they protected their neighborhood. They didn't allow, certain types of people, criminals and stuff, anywhere near their kids or stuff. So, I said, okay. And of course, the buildings, as you know, they're just so interesting. They're more like a little village than they are a big towering city. So.
Yes. Oh, it's so beautiful. And you mentioned earlier about the two parents who are the matriarch and patriarch of the family. Can you talk about that and how the roles of matriarch and patriarch evolved over the generations?
Yes, well, that's what we were discussing, is that they're passing the baton.
Mhm.
And so, you know, they were within all immigrant families, you really listened to your parents. You didn't argue with them. You did not, you respected them, and you pretty much did what they told you to do. Then you get into the generation of the godmothers. Well, the godmothers have the kids, but the kids can get a little more unruly. They're a little bit more, free and easy, but the godmothers are still trying to maintain control without stifling them. And the godmothers want to ease them into the larger world, but they don't want them to go too fast. Then you get to the godmother's children, and they are more impatient. It's like America. By the time you're into the 50s, people are a little more rebellious, the music, everything. So I think that the roles do evolve in time, and that's what was interesting to me about covering the different decades.
Yeah, what was amazing is you made each character so different within the godmothers. They all had their own strengths and weaknesses. And did you know kind of where the story was going to go as you were writing it? Did you plan it ahead?
The short answer to that is yes and no, because I do sort of have an outline, but I always tell people it's like driving in a car and you have a GPS system. And so you keyed in your destination, you know where you want to go, but as you're driving, it might say, well, you better not take that road. There's too much traffic, or maybe this turn, is a little more out of the way, but it's more interesting. So, I think that's how it is when you're plotting, don't you think? And I think also, I think about a book a long time before I actually start writing it. I wake up in the middle of the night and write little things on Post-its, and stuff like that. So, and then I collect all that stuff. So those characters are kind of talking to me along the way. I hear them. I hear the different way that they speak, the voices, and what they think. So that sort of gets you there too. I always tell people, people who are budding writers, make sure you write things down that you think of, because you're going to forget them. You think that you'll always remember, even Paul McCartney said that. He said he'd wake up and then sing into a recorder right by his bed because he knew. So. A little bit of breakup over there. I think you'll come back in a second.
I'm so sorry.
No, you're fine.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Do you use a program like Scrivener or anything like that as you're working, or how do you amass all the materials and keep it at your fingertips?
Oh, I'm such a dinosaur with computers. I really am. And I'll tell you what I don't like. Every time there's an upgrade or a program that you're working on to write, there's always something that they change. And I don't like it when they interfere, like you're right in the middle of something and wouldn't you like to upgrade? That drives me crazy. So, and I turn off the grammar checker and all that stuff. I can't stand it. So, I'm just a very basic, I just do the word processing, that's on there. And that's it really. I don't do a lot of fancy stuff. I'm afraid of these programs.
Fair enough. And what do you want readers to take away from the Godmothers? What do you want them to leave having, after having read the book?
Well, I think that life, without being too simplistic, life has its ups and downs, and I don't like to make a story like all grim or all too happy. I think that you have to incorporate all of that. But what I'm finding that people are saying to me is that they come away really glad to see women being portrayed, I guess, more realistically, as being strong, having ideas, not being airheads, but at the same time not being karate chopping, superheroes either. So my characters are, they reflect the women that I knew, the women growing up and my friends, they can be more serious. I think that women are discouraged from being serious, and you can be serious and still be funny, have a sense of humor, have a sense of life, be uplifted. I mean, people have told me they feel good when they finish the book. So that's nice, because I do want people to feel like, life is good, as I think that's what Mario Puzo had the Godfather say just before he died, how beautiful life is, So I wanted to share that, what I had, been raised on, women who woke up every day and they were happy. They weren't miserable, and they weren't happy in a sappy way. They were just glad to be alive and to be, part of the thing.
And they are so three-dimensional, the women. They're
Yeah.
You do come away feeling like they're friends.
Yeah.
Can you talk about a little about the cover, which is so striking, and how that came to be? I love cover stories.
Well, we did go through quite a few covers, and it wasn't the easiest thing to conceptualize because we didn't know if we should show 4 women, so you'd know, that there was more than one godmother. And, we just, I just think, to William Morrow's credit, they just kept, working at it, and they tried different things, different approaches, lighter, darker, and different figures. But somehow what I like about this cover is that they captured, like, there's a figure in the background. You kind of feel like you could walk in there. It's not like a flat wall. There's somebody in there, and there's even a door in the back, So it really, to me, looks like it could have been Amy's restaurant, Amy, the character in the book. It could have been any of these places where they had to meet with Strollo, or maybe it was the Copacabana when they had to meet. They ran into Frank Costello, who was a silent partner, by the way, of the Copa. So, I could almost hear the glasses and dishes clinking in the background of that. So I was very happy when they came up with that.
Yes. Oh, I agree. And did you always want to be a writer?
Yeah, I was one of those little kids. I mean, I wrote my first poem when I was 8 years old. And I don't know. There was a toy store that had a giant wall of books in the back, which, is unusual for a toy store, all little kids' books. And my mother would take me there, and she'd say, just let me know what books you like. And they would appear next to my plate for my birthday. She was also big on Easter. So when we had an Easter basket, there was a book near it too, So that was great. And I loved libraries. I just thought they were heaven. I mean, every book you could possibly think of, So, and at some point I started writing mystery novels. I think I was about 11. And for some reason I got this idea in my head that every novel every chapter should have 10 pages, and the book should be 10 chapters. I don't know where I got this. So I was always scribbling. I always had ink stains because I'm left-handed. Ink or pencil, I always had smudges.
Oh, I love that. And then how did you kind of come into your own as a writer? I know you did a residency on the south of France that we were talking about earlier. Can you tell us a little about your journey?
Well, I for a little while I was writing plays, and then I was writing screenplays, and that was I had the Edward Albee residency because of a script that I had written, and the Eugene O'Neill Playwrights Conference. So I was doing scripting for a while. I think that's good training, even for novelists, because it helps you with dialogue. It helps you get things across about the character, because you can't say, and then, she had blonde hair and she had this kind of personality. You have to sort of make that come out, in the way she speaks. So I think that was good training. Plus, working on the daytime dramas, what I loved about that is that you didn't have time to make it perfect. You just had to meet that deadline, and you better have gotten it perfect somewhere along the way, but it got done. I liked the idea of things getting done. I even now get impatient with people who drag things out, because and that is not to say that I do a lot of revising with my work. I think of that as like alchemy, where you're just trying to refine it, just end up with the gold and not the dross, So I do work on my books, but I don't like making too big a project out of doing something. I like to really get in there,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm one for checking things off lists.
Yes.
Get things done.
Yeah.
And I agree. I think, having seen so much theater, that the way.
Oh, we lost you for a second, but it doesn't last long. I think we'll get you back. I hear a little bit. Yeah.
So sorry. I was just saying how dialogue is so helpful. So what's next for you? Are you working on something new?
Yes, I have 2 historical novels that I am working on. And I think I usually have, a stove has 4 burners. I usually have 4 things going on, and how you eventually know that one's ready and you move it to the front. So that's what's happening. I've got one that's moved to the front. So they're historical fiction as well.
Oh, good, good. I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll throw it over to questions from the audience. And again, my apologies for this freezing issue.
Oh, it doesn't last long. It's fine.
I'm so sorry. I have to go and unplug my router and heat it up. And so my last question is, what are you reading now? And what have you loved recently?
Oh, I'm sorry to say that part of the problem of doing historical fiction is that you're reading so much nonfiction for your books.
Yes.
That you don't get a chance to keep up with people. I mean, I like your book. I just got your latest one.
Oh.
And I always, it's almost like I hide things as a gift for myself. Like as soon as I get time to relax, that's the thing that I'm going to read next, So Fiona Davis is definitely on that list.
You're too kind.
I have Margaret Atwood's book of poetry, which my husband got me for Christmas, and I still haven't sat down with it, but that's because I'm doing that thing where I'm holding on to it.
Yes.
So
it's your reward.
Yeah, it is.
Well, thank you so much. It's just been wonderful. And why don't we hand it over to Patty for some questions from the audience?
Sure. And we have a bunch of questions from the audience.
Great.
A lot of people congratulating you. Happy publication day.
Thank you.
A lot of people already bought your book.
Great.
I think I liked this question. Is there anything surprising that you learned about the mafia when you were doing your research? I mean, that's a great question because they're so glamorized, the mobs and the families. And so anything that you went, oh boy, or that's real, or that's not real, or.
Yeah. I'll tell you, they were strangely touching because they knew that the life of a mobster is that it doesn't end well. No, everybody dies, but boy, they don't die well usually. Sometimes they die of old age and they're lucky, but they knew where things were headed and they wished that they had more opportunities. Frank Costello said, I went to the school of hard knocks. I attended 10 universities, and also, I found that the older generation of gangsters were they were formal and there were certain things they just wouldn't do. As things evolved, I think that the biggest problem was when the drugs got into it. I think that was just unforgivable. There were two gangsters who were pretty much responsible for getting that onto the street.
Which was when? I'm curious in the timeline. When was that?
That happened in the early 70s was at the worst. It was coming in before that. It started in the late 50s and it was seeping in the 60s. But boy, it really hit the streets in the 70s and the cities showed it. A lot of what we think of when we say, boy, New York City was really terrible then. It's because of that, that trade. And frankly, I think it ruined things for the gangsters because what happened was that the politicians who, let's face it, were playing ball with them up until now about prohibition because it was kind of a dumb law to begin with, and people could sort of make allowances for that. But when it came to the drugs, the Senate and the committees woke up and they put stiffer sentences. And that meant that the lower level guys might rat you out if they were facing a very long prison time. So that surprised me because that was really what the difference was. That's why these guys, like you saw Marlon Brando say on The Godfather, said drugs is not going to work for us because, then we lose our political connections and everything else. So, that really was the beginning of the end for them.
Do you think that the underworld, the mob is alive and well now?
Well, it's more diverse and diffuse. Whether you have the cybercrime, and no ethnicity has a lock on gangsters. Every immigrant group, everybody that had come in had some kind of a situation like that where they had gangsters. And so I guess you have to be very careful. You have to welcome immigrants. You have to let them have the opportunities that others have, simply because if you don't, you're going to create an underworld. Doesn't matter who it was, and so is it there? It's there in other insidious ways. I think the biggest problem we're facing now is on the on the web, internet. Yeah. Cybercrime.
Oh, that's so interesting. During COVID, I watched Peaky Blinders, which was a great, but I think they really depict all the different groups, ethnicities, and that was so interesting, I thought. And you're right, every pocket of immigrants had their own underworld.
They
So
did. They really
yeah,
did,
yeah,
So
so
you have to
interesting.
you have to ask the larger questions. So how does this happen in society? What are we doing, that is creating situation like that? So
Okay. This You've got a big fan in Stephanie here. She asks, which was the easiest character to write, and who was the most difficult to portray?
that's a good question. Let me think about that. Well, for some reason, Philomena was easy to write. I guess because, there was just something about her, that she was a character who was better able to put aside her visceral feelings of whether I like or don't like somebody, and she was more practical. She could understand that she had to form alliances in order to survive. So that was an interesting character, because she was then looking at the other characters and saying, look, she's lonely too, or she needs a friend too, So I liked that. I wanted to make sure that the real historical characters were still real people. I mean, I really feel strongly about that. I don't like to have historical people who are too interchangeable. They could be anybody. If you're writing about Hemingway, or if you're writing about a gangster, they have to have their individual qualities. And I wrote about Picasso, for instance. So I think you have to be true to the real people. I don't think you can take liberties with them. I think you have to do the best you can of how that character would have responded when they meet your fictional characters. So I try to be faithful to them, and therefore not to judge them.
Oh, I think that's a great answer. And it's funny because if you had asked me who was the easiest to write for you as a reader, I mean, I felt most connected to Philomena as well. Like somehow I related to her the most. She seemed the most real, the most current, even though it was written a long time ago. So it's funny because it came through to me as a reader. I don't know. What do you think, Fiona? You sort of attached to her as well?
Yeah, I agree. And the book opens with her too, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
or after the prologue. Yeah.
And that's such a story that she goes through.
Yes. I mean, it does break your heart. I mean, it's just, you don't want to ever see, people in their youth suffer. You don't want young people to suffer, I found Lucy also. Lucy took on a life of her own. She kind of surprised me, and that's the Irish girl who was a nurse. And she just, I don't know, she just seemed to stand up to everything, and she wanted a piece of the action. so she muscled her way in, I think. But I do have a fondness for all of them, all four of them, I have to say.
So you've written scripts and for daytime TV, and also, what's your favorite genre to write? I'm interested that you want to go back to historical fiction. Are you tempted to sort of go back to writing, or to poetry, or to back to script writing? It's run the gamut.
Yeah, I know. I have been asked to do a script for the novel that I've Cooking for Picasso. So that's kind of in the works. But I have been writing poetry all along. But most of them are sort of, this is what I want to do with this poem. They're not finished. So it's the kind of thing where you have these things in notebooks and they're not ready. I go back to that idea of cooking. I do like to cook. So burners, and you have these things going, and some are at a slower simmer, and others are more of a saute, and they're going to happen faster.
And it sounds like some are for sharing and some aren't for sharing.
Oh no, they'll eventually come to light when I feel like, that I can, share them with people, that they're ready. There is this thing about ready. I know, Fiona, you must know this, that, when something's time has come, when you need to give it more attention, and when it's getting there, it's getting closer to the finish line, that, okay, I can show this to, well, I start with my husband and then my agent, and then the editor. So
can I ask, who would you cast in the roles of the Godmothers in terms of celebrities?
Good question. And it does read like it's going to be a great Netflix series. Come on. It's gotta be.
I think so. I think it would be good. You know, Marissa Tomei pops into mind. Um,
Mm.
she was in something about Staten Island, and she played a mother. She said that was the worst thing she should have done was played a mother because now they were giving her all mother roles. But I think she'd like my mothers, so my godmothers. Um, you know, I tend to think of people that I've seen in the past, but I think we'd have to start with younger actresses. So I am starting to look for them now, you know, and see who's out there. Um, because I am more of an old movie fan myself, you know, so I tend to look at movies that are decades old, you know. So now I have to keep an eye out for someone who's new.
Have you had any interest to option the book? I mean, it just came out today, but I can't believe that someone's not going to.
I have an agent who is talking to people now, as he says.
That's
So
great.
that's as far as I can say, but I do think there's something coming.
Oh, it's just so terrific.
Yeah.
Let's see who else has popped on here. Oh, this is a good question. Did you plan out the novel or did it emerge organically? And we talked a little bit about the writing process. Fiona asked that, but
Yes.
and there was a nugget, it sounds like, that got you going. But I think all our audience members are really interested in the process, and that you do
Yes.
use a computer or you use sticky notes or
Yeah.
sort of behind the scenes of how you put it all, or the cork board. Can you tell us more about your process?
All of the above, to be honest. Yes.
Okay.
I do the little sticky notes, and I think it's mostly longhand notes in the beginning, which I kind of wish, you know, sometimes they're hard to read, especially if you did it at night with a flashlight and you're trying not to wake up anybody else, you know. But I start out with that. And then eventually, you know, when I first started when I was working on Cooking for Picasso, I was doing key scenes. I wasn't doing it in a linear way. But now I think that, and the other part of it is it's hard to remember sometimes, but I think with this book, I knew where things were going, but as we discussed, you have to know their ages, you have to know what time period. So there was a little tinkering with that, you know, getting that right, because you want the flow of the time to seem natural. And you definitely don't want to force things just because of, I think the biggest thing is to get past your research. One thing that Margaret Atwood said to me was, you know, we only have what's on the page. You have a lot of stuff in your head, and the only thing the reader sees is what's on the page. So I think the research should only be like the tip of the iceberg in the book. I think that there's a mountain of research, you know, we could be sitting down, you know, having coffee and discussing all the research that went into this book, but you're not going to see that, you know, in front of you. You shouldn't, you know. I think that you're seeing things happening. You're only seeing that much, but there is a whole iceberg underneath. Definitely.
Fiona, I bet you can relate to that. She's frozen again, but she'll come back.
She will.
I said, I bet you can relate to that.
Yeah,
You know,
oh, definitely.
what the balance of research is. And
yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's half the fun, is trying to incorporate nuggets in without, you know, weighing down the story.
Exactly.
Camille, I want to ask you about Cooking for Picasso. Just, I would love you to plug the book a little bit, because
Sure.
some people meet you and this is their first book. I loved that. It's very different. Your two books are very different, but I want our listeners also to know about your previous book, because it was so delicious. I have to use that word. And it would also be a great summer read. So if they're finding you today through this launch, I want them to think about that book as well. Can you give us a little blurb on that book?
Oh, sure. Well, you know, that book started with, because I had been in the south of France on this writer's residency, you can't, every time you turn around, you see Picasso. I mean, there he is, there's something he's done. There's, you know, and I literally saw a big poster of him with those dark eyes looking at me and saying, you know, it's like you're saying, so what are you doing here? You know, and so I had to find out more about him, because I only knew the cliche stuff, really, you know, and I came across this little incident in his life in which he was in the throes of a divorce, because, you know, he would mess things up with his wife. And he, because of the divorce situation, his studio was padlocked, and in Paris, he wasn't allowed to go in there and paint. And he was just going crazy anyway. And so he took a little detour, and he went to the south of France in the off season, in like March, April, you know. And nobody knows what happened to him in that period. They don't know who he was with, why he went there. He sneaked in, he used his father's name. He didn't, and I checked again. I had to do some real digging on this, but I found the paintings that he started to do them because he hadn't been painting for a year. And all they know is he went down there, and when he came back, he had picked up his brush and he started painting again. So I said, well, something had to happen. And I looked at the paintings and I came across these two paintings of an unknown woman. They weren't sure who she was. Could she have been Dora Maar? Was she Marie Therese's dark-haired sister? All this stuff. And I said, okay, that's my girl, the girl in the painting. And then I just was thinking, well, I know Picasso. I know that he was used to having women do things for him. So who cooked for him? And that became the question of the whole book, who cooked for him? And so I had this girl whose parents owned a restaurant, and Picasso used to like to kind of walk around incognito. I thought he might have slipped in there and had a meal. And it was not that unusual in those days to say to a restaurant, could you bring a basket of, a meal up to my house, so I have lunch or something like that. So I said, well, then this girl, who's the daughter, is going to be the one who delivers the meals to him. And that's where the whole framework came. But it did come from a true incident in his life. It's just that there were these gaps. And I love filling in the gaps. Oh, boy, that's just wonderful, because that's where your imagination really, has.
That's a great story. That was the seed, and then fill in the gaps. That's terrific.
Right.
I'm going to ask Fiona a couple of questions, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Because I know there's a lot of people on this webinar tonight that are curious what you're working on. We talked a little bit before, what's coming up next. I know one of your books is coming out, I think next week in paperback. Am I right, Fiona?
It has come out. Yeah. The Lion of Fifth Avenue. Yeah. It came out May 25th.
May 25th. Right. Okay. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about your next book?
Sure. And if I freeze, just do the signal.
Okay.
Okay. We have it all down now. I love this. We have a code. So the next book is set at the Frick Collection.
Oh.
And I'm very excited. It's in 1919 and 1966. And that was a Gilded Age home to the Fricks on Fifth Avenue, and then became a museum, and is a wonderful, wonderful building to incorporate into a story. So we'll see how that goes.
That sounds great.
And can we ask you what's on your bedside table? And we were also talking before that Fiona's a great reader and also a great admirer of other writers. Anything coming across your desk, galleys, or things by your bedside table you'd like to share with our participants?
Yeah, I love The Rose Code by Kate Quinn.
I
thought that was terrific. And Liberty by Caitlin Greenwich is one I'm reading now, which is just beautiful. Yeah, there's a lot of really great historical fiction out there. It's wonderful.
Terrific. Okay, let's hope there's more questions coming in. We have a few more minutes. I guess everybody's wondering, Camille, how long it took you to write The Godmothers. I mean, it is epic. It's a saga. You would think it would, a lot of people are wondering that.
It's funny, it didn't take as long as you might think, because let me see, and that's another thing that I tend to forget, and people ask me, but I would say, let's see, I'd say probably about a year and a half, but it overlaps with the research. I must have been reading about it before that. So I'd say, yeah, a year and a half.
Okay, wow. So you use the analogy a lot of burners. What else is on your burner? I want to know what's on your 4 burners. And by the way, Camille, I have 6 burners on my stove. So
okay, that's right. And I keep
give us
saying,
a little. I'm curious.
Yeah. Well, I have something I'm working on now that I actually was working on for off and on for about, more than 5 years. And it's one of those things that I would, work on and say, no, it needs more of something of this. And then I get this idea. Yeah, that'll do it. So that's something that that's coming to fruition, now. I now have a manuscript that's coming for that. And I, somewhere along the way, I think I'd like to write a ghost story. I have one kind of, that's one of those little simmering ones. And so, I like to experiment. I know that, sometimes one of my books is different from the other books. And yet I say, well, I wrote it, so it must be me, So,
Have either one of you thought about writing a YA book?
yeah, I have, because I
just
loved
curious.
YA books when I was a kid.
Yeah. And I
Um,
think I mean, both for you, I think historical fiction lends itself or could be a good way to sort of jam a little history down a young person's, in a good way, in a good way.
yeah, yeah, no, I think the kids respond to that sort of thing
I
because,
do too.
yeah, um, because you share with them the books that you liked as a kid and they respond to them, even though they may be more old fashioned now,
Right.
um,
And
Yeah,
there's so
YA books are fascinating these days. They're wonderful. There's so
they,
much
they
out
really
there.
are. It blows my mind how great they are. And I love when sort of authors will delve into it a little bit or do a kid's book. I think it's great. And so let's see what else we have here. Oh, this is an interesting one. Are there any, you wrote a lot about the guys in the mafia. So in your research, did you find any true life women, wives, or, I mean, they were always in the shadow, but I'm wondering if you read about.
No, because they were sort of, treated as the wives. So no, I didn't really find in my research something to work with for the godmothers. No, and that's part of what bothered me because I knew they must have been there. I also did not want to write a story from the point of view of the wife of one of these big guys, the big bosses, because I don't know, that just didn't feel like it would be right for me. I just felt that I would be a little more, my hands would be more tied in that kind of a situation. And I don't really always want to write about the big, powerful people. I like to think of the ones who, have to deal with the powerful ones, who somehow just their lives, they bump into them in one way or the other, or they're influenced by them. That's, for instance, with Picasso, I didn't write from the point of view of one of his mistresses. I wanted to write from a young woman's perspective who's outside of that. So you are seeing it from the outside, and yet from the inside because she comes into that life.
No, I think that lens is so cool. It's just terrific. Let me see. I think there's another one that popped in. I think we have a few more minutes.
Okay.
Oh, everybody likes what you recommended, Fiona. And I think a lot of people follow you and depend on your recommendations. Oh, and also, Camille, I liked the food in the book. Did you give that special attention? Clearly, can you talk to us a little bit about your interest in food? And it does play a prominent role in both your novels. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, my husband and I like to cook together. It's a way that we communicate and, enjoy our time, and talk to each other. So we are talking in the kitchen all the time. For Picasso, I went and spoke to, 4 or 5-star chefs, and they were terrific. They let me into their kitchen. One of them let me stir the sauce. Oh, I was so thrilled. And they showed me all these different things. But every chef I met, for one thing, they're not flamboyant the way they're portrayed on television. They really are, in some ways, very touching. They're very sweet, and they all tell you that the reason they became a chef was either because of their grandmother or their mother's cooking, and they remembered it vividly and being in that kitchen or being with them. Jacques Pepin talked to me a great deal about that because his mother ran a restaurant. And as a matter of fact, he gave me a blurb for Cooking for Picasso. When I sent him the book, he said that it reminded him of his mother. And I was really thrilled with that because I thought, wow, okay, now I'll find out if I got this right or not, And he said it made him homesick for his mother's coq au vin, which I considered a wonderful thing. So, but all of the meals that are in there that I described, I researched and cooked one way or the other, with the exception of, what was it? The one that we actually had. And in the coq au vin, we were supposed to use the rooster's blood. I drew the line at that. So I didn't go that far. But, and with the godmothers too, with the Italian cooking, I mean, I just think that cooking is such an art form. And I guess it's a release for me because it's not, typing and stuff. It's not the words on the page. It's like out there, it's colors and scent and texture and everything, So, Yeah, I did quite a bit of research to even to the historical. I went deep into history on the French and the Italian cooking, which, by the way, kind of all started with the Italians in the Renaissance anyway, with um, yeah, I loved reading just the whole history of how food shifted from being medicinal to being, pleasurable. And that was fascinating because they used to have this whole thing about whether food was wet or dry or hot or cold and what the season was. And doctors or, these medical people would tell you, you have this ailment, therefore you need more dry or more wet. It was amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, I went crazy.
No, that's a great answer. Who knew? Who knew? So I think we're closing in on the hour.
Okay.
If this presentation hasn't sold you on buying the Godmothers today, we make it really easy for you. I'm telling you, I flew through this and I have to read a lot. Usually I'll sort of plow through half the book, enough to host, but I just such a great summer read, so rich, really a saga. I really can dig your teeth into. So we're going to list both your books, Camille, in the chat. Remember, we have signed copies at RJ's, so please order them through our website. We also have all Fiona's books, all her backlist, also listed. I mean, we're talking to two amazing historical fiction writers right here. So we are so grateful you decided to share your publication day with us.
Thank you.
Fiona, always a pleasure.
Oh,
And please come to RJ's when things open up.
Absolutely.
You're not that far.
Thank you for bringing Fiona and the two of us together, because I got to talk to Fiona. That was lovely.
Yes, you're a good match. You're a good match. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And don't forget to buy the book. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.